Okay, then I think the time has come to open this webinar. The number of attendees is still ticking upward somewhat. All are welcome. I'm happy to welcome you all to this webinar, both the panelists and the audience. This webinar is the third in the Nordic Sustainable Finance Talks, a series of webinars hosted by the Nordic Banking Associations. So a big thank you to Finance Denmark, Finance Finland, the Swedish Bankers Association. My name is Idar Kreutzer. I'm the CEO of Finance Norway, and I'll be your host and your moderator today. I think we all have seen that sustainable finance has been very important on the agenda over the last couple of years. Some of us being in this for a while have probably thought that more has happened in the last 2 years than the previous 18. And sustainable finance is important not only to the financial services sector, but to the entire economy. We see that the demand for sustainable debt and sustainable investments are growing exponentially, and the field of sustainable finance is getting more and more regulated. Climate and environmental side has been in the core of the attention, and EU's taxonomy has been an important driver of that. When getting expanded to EU's next 4 environmental objectives, it becomes a climate and environmental focused taxonomy. However, managing sustainability is a significantly broader and more complex scope. The social side of sustainability is crucial, and the EU platform on sustainable finance is now working on a social taxonomy as well. And we will hear more about that in a minute. We are going through an energy and emissions transition. That has to do with technology, and it has to do with the economy and finance. But most importantly, it has to do with people. If we do not get the people factor right, the transition will be a difficult one. It will never succeed, and the market is getting their eyes up for the social side as well. The volume of social bonds increased by a magnitude of 7 in 2020 compared to 2019, and that is the backdrop for today's discussion. A closer look at the social dimension of sustainable finance and sustainable investing. And before we start, let me just share with you 2 householding items. One, this is a webinar. It's recorded, and it will be shared after the event. Secondly, questions to speakers are welcome. Please use your Q&A function down on the bottom side, the bottom part of your screen to post a question. And we will monitor the questions and put forward questions to the speakers. With this as a backdrop, to present our first keynote speaker, Antje Snewijs. Antje, her day job is as the secretary of the working group of church investors in Germany, but she's currently the leader of a subgroup that's called social taxonomy in the EU platform on sustainable finance. Ms. Snewijs has been working with sustainable investments since 1991 and have given numerous lectures and published several books and papers on sustainable finance. Amongst these, a course book on ethical investments. We are thrilled that you are here today to present the platform's work on the social taxonomy. Antje, the stage is yours.
Okay. Well, you can hear me?
Yes.
I still can't stop my video because you stopped it. Okay, now it works. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me to this talks. It's really a pleasure and an honor to talk to you today. And I would like to give you an introduction to our first thinking about the social taxonomy. Of course, we also think that the social side is important and should be looked at. However, there are things to consider which are different in social than in green. I start my screen now, and see whether this is okay. Can you see this all right?
Yes, we can see it very well.
Good. So let me first give you a very quick overview of what has been done in the green taxonomy, and then come to the social part. The green taxonomy, as you already mentioned, has got 6 objectives: mitigation, adaptation, transition to circular economy, pollution prevention and control, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, and biodiversity. As you know, there are already detailed criteria on mitigation and adaptation. There are presently, work is going on presently on the other 4 objectives. All in all, the structure of the green taxonomy is that it is based on activities, on economic activities, and these economic activities have to contribute substantially to one of these 6 objectives and have to fulfill certain do no significant harm criteria. And on top of this, and here already the social issue comes in, they have to be aligned to minimum social safeguards, and these are defined to be the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines. So a bit of social is already in the green taxonomy. However, this has to be defined more closely. The platform, the task of the platform is to give recommendations to the EU Commission. So we are not working out regulations and delegated acts. That's the Commission's work. We are recommending, working out recommendations for that. All in all, the platform as it is today has got 4 working groups. The technical working group is working on other sectors and on the 4 objectives, which are not yet worked out. There is subgroup 3 working on significantly harmful and low impact activities. Subgroup 4, that's us, working on social objectives, and subgroup 5 working on data and usability. And of course, there is a close link between all of the subgroups 1, 3, and 4, and data and usability, as in the end it all has to work in practice. And a very important date for you, if you are interested in the social part, is that there will be an outreach in July, and there will be a consultation on our report beginning in August. So you might like to consider these. I know that there has already been a report from our group circulated. However, that is not authoritative. We are still working on it. It is a leaked document. So please don't consider that as a final one. So our task in the social taxonomy group is to work out a structure of a social taxonomy and to work it out along the lines of substantial contribution and do no significant harm criteria for social issues. So these structural elements, which are already present in the green taxonomy, should also be considered in the social taxonomy. And also to reflect on other objectives like business ethics, governance, anti-bribery, and tax compliance. And that is important as a second task to advise the European Commission on Article 18, which are the minimum safeguards. So we were asked first to work out a structure and then to work on minimum safeguards, which sometimes put a bit of a problem to us because we were more or less stumbling across minimum safeguards nearly in all of our meetings, because there are very different ideas of what they might look like, and depending on what they are looking like, the social taxonomy will actually work. So that is a bit of a problem and sometimes in practice. So the first thing we did, because we still had some questions about is there a need for a social taxonomy? And we worked out why we think there is a need. Of course, it already has been mentioned in the report of the HLEC, the first expert group working on this on the EU level, that social objectives have to be acknowledged. There's, of course, as has already been mentioned, a need for a just transition when we have these very important and necessary green transitions. People have to be taken into account. And we say that investors are increasingly looking for social investment opportunities. And there is pressure for change. And that means there is a risk for investors if they don't consider social issues. And just as with the green transition, there is a lack of definition what actually means social in the corporate field or in the economic field. And so the task of a social taxonomy will be to have a clearer definition of what it actually means. So when we started at this, we had this very nice and tidy 6 objectives in the environmental taxonomy, and we had a lot of issues, topics, ideas for a social, which of course would include human rights, but also access to healthcare or basic human or products which serve basic human needs. We had decent employment, equality, non-discriminations, all these issues which come to your mind when you think about social. And the first thing we did, and probably the most important step, was to sort that out and to see, well, what the structure looked like. And we found out that some of these topics are related to processes, which says that a company has to implement certain processes to be social. And that's what we call the horizontal dimension. And that is, of course, true when it comes to the respect for human rights and to governance issues. But on the other hand, we also think that some products and services produced by companies have a social value in their own right. And that's what we call the vertical dimension. And here we have the objectives that these products and services promote adequate living conditions for all. So this is a general structure we have worked out. And another problem we were working at was that the environmental taxonomy is obviously based on science and has a very clear and firm foundation there, whereas we don't have science in the social sphere. And what we've said here is that international conventions and norms are our basis. So we are working very firmly, especially on the ground of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which includes a covenant on social, cultural, and economic rights. And of course, the other human rights included there. So we worked out objectives within these 2 dimensions, the horizontal and the vertical dimensions. And for the respect for human rights, we found that one objective will be the managing of impact, that the company has a look at what impact it has on human rights and how it can treat them responsibly. And then the 3 other objectives would be the impact on workers, on consumers, and communities. And all this implies the value chain. So we haven't got an extra objective for the value chain, because we think if we speak on workers, consumers, and communities, we mean actually that this applies to the whole value chain of a company. In governance, we are talking about good corporate governance in general, including responsible lobbying anti-corruption, and transparent and non-aggressive tax planning. Here we have to differentiate between sustainable governance and hardcore governance, and we are working on sustainable governance. There are some overlapping issues. It's difficult to separate them neatly, but we're trying to do that. And then we have the third pillar, which is adequate living conditions. And here we have the two objectives, the fulfillment of basic human needs, but also the access to essential economic services and infrastructure, including employment generation. Yes, that's a basic, I say my time is nearly up. Of course, we have gone more into depth into these three pillars, and I might like to draw your attention to topics we have found out for the horizontal dimension on respect for human rights. That would be issues like social dialogue, health and safety, decent employment, living wage. With consumers, you would consider responsible marketing, fair contracts, and enhanced product safety. And with communities, communities, that would be, of course, a safe environment and the sustainability of communities. One point which might be interesting to you in the horizontal part is probably that we base our criteria here on the AAAQ concept, which means availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality. The thing is that when it comes to the vertical dimension on products and services, the difficulty here is that you of course have a lot of companies offering these kinds of products, and that we have to qualify them somehow, because the idea of the whole exercise of having a taxonomy is to redirect capital flows. So we have to find a way to qualify these products and services in a way that capital flows are redirected to more accessible products in these spheres, and to enhance the availability of the products in the sphere of basic human needs. And we have to work out criteria here. We started to do this on housing and healthcare, and we'll continue to do this over the next months, but this is our concept we are building our criteria on. So I thank you for your patience. I finish here.
Thank you very much, Antje. You didn't test the patience at all. Time just flew because everything you presented is so interesting, and surely you gave us an insight into the complexity and like this. You gave us an insight into both the complexity, but also an understanding of the importance of the questions that you are discussing. I have a number of questions, and I will revert to them later. And also, just to the audience, please post your questions under by pushing your Q&A button, and we will monitor them and put them forward to the speakers. Let's move on now to the next speaker, and that is Karine Iheanacho Smith from Nordic Bank Investment Management. Karine is responsible for the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund's work in governance and compliance. And I have lost count on the numbers of companies you own, Karine, but I guess it's close to 10,000. So that makes you a busy person, but also very influential in this field. And you were early in introducing the social dimension. And we are very much looking forward to hear your reflections, both on your work and also on the work that we see on the regulatory front, not least from EU. Karine, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Idar. And it's great that you have taken this initiative to focus on the social dimension. So I will talk a bit about how we work on this from an investor perspective. And I have prepared some slides that I hope are coming up. Yes, there they are. So the next one, please. So most of you know us, but let me briefly say who we are. So Nordic Banking Investment Management is the manager of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And we are a large global fund. And as you see from this slide, we now have a market value of more than 11 billion kroner. And we are 70% invested in listed companies, which means that we have a small share. And you're right, Idar, it's almost now 10,000 companies in 71 countries. So we own an average 1.5% of all the world's listed companies. We have an overweight in Europe, where we own on average around 2.4%. And our mission is to create long-term value for future generations. And our starting point is that we have clear expectations to all the 9,000 plus companies we have invested in when it comes to key sustainability challenges and opportunities. And this includes environmental and social issues. And then the social issues, our main priorities are, as you can see from this slide, human rights, children's rights, anti-corruption, and tax and transparency. And I was pleased to see how well this overlapped with what Antje talked about when it comes to social issues, that under her governance chapter or pillar, she also had anti-corruption and tax and transparency. And she also talked about corporate governance, and I must say that that overlays all of these sustainability issues. So as a large fund, that's our mission, where we have a mission to create long-term value. You may think, why do we care about these issues? And that's quite easy to explain, because the world's economic, environmental, and social future is our future. Long-term value creation will be dependent on how well companies manage the many sustainability challenging facing them, and that includes on social issues. So our expectations are directed at companies' board. We believe the board should have oversight of the key sustainability risks and opportunities faced by their companies, and they should account for associated outcomes. So let me then turn to human rights specifically, as this is at the core of social issues. So we expect companies to integrate human rights into their policies, corporate strategy, risk management, and reporting. And our expectations are based on the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights that Antje talked about, the UNGP. So companies should conduct ongoing human rights due diligence based on the perspective of those who may be negatively impacted. And in line with the guiding principles, we encourage companies to identify their salient human rights issues, which means the human rights that may be at risk of the most severe negative impact through a company's business operations. And that includes its supply chains and other business relationships. And we believe companies should have an adequate supply chain management system, including policies for detecting and preventing human rights abuses, monitoring systems, contractual clauses, incentives, and corrective instruments, such as, for instance, education and training. And it's important that the companies also publicly disclose their human rights strategies, policies, and processes, and report on their implementation of the guiding principles and other relevant international standards. So next slide, please. So, yes, there it is. Okay, thank you. We are often asked to what extent we have specific policies around the promotion of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And the answer is that we don't. But as you see here, our expectations support many of the SDGs. I mean, gender equality, as an example, is at the heart of our human rights expectations. Next slide, please. So we are an active owner. We aim to be a good owner, and we aim to be a supportive owner. And we do this by being predictable, principled, and transparent. And our ownership work includes voting and dialogue. We also assess companies' work against our expectations each year. And let me now describe this in a bit further detail. So if you take next slide, please. And let me start with company dialogue. I mean, to make good investment decisions, It's important to know our companies well. And engagement is one of the most effective ways in which we can convey our views and influence companies, and also to learn more about them. And last year, we had almost 3,000 company meetings, basically from our kitchens and living room. And we discussed social issues in 839 meetings. We count everything we do, so you're going to hear a bit about numbers here. But as you see from this slide, climate change was the most frequently sustainability topic raised in company meetings, but the second largest category was what we called other social issues, which included COVID, supply chain management, and customer relations. And also what you see from this slide is that human rights, human capital management, were two other much discussed themes. And through these discussions, we gain insights into companies' preparedness to manage the key social risks and opportunities they face in their operations. And since we first started to raise human rights and other social issues in dialogues, and we started with this in 2006, we have broadened the scale and scope of our dialogues. And I'll give you some examples sort of what we discuss with the companies. So last year we had a dialogue with selected telecommunication companies on their policies and systems for assessing and managing risks related to children's rights. And children are, as many of us with children know too well, a growing user group for digital tools and online products and services. And this, of course, could present a risk to their health and their rights, and also constitute a business risk for telecommunications companies. Another example is that we began a new dialogue last year with selected companies providing food delivery and transport services on their approach to organizing their workforce. And the aim was really to understand the choice of business model and how they view risk related to regulatory developments, lobbying, and also respect for labor rights. And whilst we want to get to know the companies better through these dialogues, we also aim for the companies to improve practices. Next slide, please. Another important ownership tool is voting. Every year, we vote on more than 100,000 resolutions. And we're now in the middle of the hectic voting season, so it's a truly busy time. Just an example, only today we will vote on more than 2,000 resolutions. So our default position is to support the board, but we vote against the board when we believe they have failed to adequately manage our interests as shareholders. And this could include how they handle social issues. We, as I said, aim to be predictable and transparent, also in our voting. So we now publish all our voting intentions 5 days before the general meeting. And in addition, we explain our voting rationale when we vote against the board's recommendations. So if you wonder how we voted on a certain resolution, you can go into our website and check, and also see the rationale behind it. We have published a note, as you see here, that describes how we assess shareholders' resolutions on sustainability. Every year, there are a few shareholders' resolutions coming up on certain sustainability topics. And we support social-related shareholder proposals if they address a material issue and do not seek to micromanage the company's strategy and operations. And we have a dedicated team that reviews every sustainability shareholder proposal. It is a time-consuming job, I can tell you, but it's important that we do this in a principled way. And let me give a few examples again on how we support social issues in our voting. So last year we voted in favor of a resolution, so two resolutions, one at Amazon and Facebook, calling for greater transparency about the human rights risk assessments related to the products and platforms. And based on our expectations on children's rights, we also supported a new resolution calling on Facebook to assess the risk exploitation of children on the company's platform. And although these resolutions didn't win majority support, the number of shareholder resolutions getting majority support are increasing, as you can see from this slide. And I believe it's a mix of these resolutions getting more relevant, but it's probably also a shifting sentiment in the shareholder community on these issues. So next slide, please. I mentioned that we assess companies' work against our expectations. This is a tedious analysis we do every year, but it gives us a unique database, which is an excellent basis for both company engagement and investment decisions. So what do we see? So we have noted for several years that companies score much better on environmental than social topics, which is why to discuss social topics is so relevant. And this is also true in 2020, which you can see from these slides. Many more companies have very strong or strong reporting on topics such as climate change, water management, and deforestation. This should probably not surprise us too much. It is linked both to the strong reporting frameworks out there, such as the CDP questionnaire, but probably also the focus companies have paid to the climate environmental issues. So as you see from these slides, human rights and children's rights end up somewhere in the middle of the pack. Next slide, please. From our database, we can also look at different indicators. So this slide shows board oversight. As an investor, board oversight is a key premise in our expectations. The board is our representatives, and they are accountable not just for financial, but also social and environmental outcomes. And we see that although many boards oversee anti-corruption efforts, far fewer are involved in ensuring that the company respects human rights in their own operations and value chain. Next slide, please. So we can dig even further into the data and start discerning what companies are generally good at and what they're not so good at. And I've pulled out data here on a number of questions related to human rights due diligence and supply chain management. And if you look very closely, and I apologize for the small letters, so these are just some examples. So what we see is that from the companies assessed on this issue last year, 60% do some assessment of human rights. It's not amazing, but encouraging. But we see that only 10% actually disclose the most salient issues. Many only list 2 or 3 issues, which makes us question whether they have in fact done a full saliency analysis. And the same applied to supply chain management. We see that code of conduct and supply chain management systems are popular, but again, few companies actually disclose how they map the most critical suppliers, especially beyond tier 1, which makes it difficult for us as an investor to know whether the company has an appropriate risk-based approach to follow this up. So next slide, please. So our ownership work and knowledge of companies is important for investment decisions. And we may choose to divest from companies if we believe they don't have a sustainable business model. And also where we consider active ownership is not appropriate. And last year we divested from 9 companies due to human rights issues and 77 companies based on tax and transparency. But in addition to reducing our risk, and we have in total divested from 314 companies since we started doing this in 2012, we also made money on this. Since 2012, risk-based divestment have increased the cumulative return on our equity portfolio by around 0.4 percentage point, which is actually 0.02 percentage point annually. Next slide, please. So in addition, we have ethical exclusions, and the fund must not be invested in companies that produce certain product or whose conduct contributes to violation of fundamental ethical norms, including serious or systematic human rights violations. And in last year, 8 companies were excluded due to human rights violations. And you may have seen today even that we announced exclusion of 3 companies based on human rights considerations. So next slide, please. And here we're coming to the end. So let me conclude by reiterating that we as an investor have clear expectations to the companies we have invested in on social issues. Our analysis show that the companies still have a long way to go. But I thought I should end on a positive note. So what I would like to say is that we have seen clear improvements on how companies handle social issues in 2020. And I think it's promising to see that even in a pandemic year, companies' work have been strengthened. So thank you.
Karine, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. And your focus on long-term value creation and the responsibility of the board is well received. And there are no doubt that you are a leader when it comes to the quality of your work. But I would like to emphasize that you also take a leading position when it comes to accountability and transparency. You monitor everything you do. And you share it with the market. That's important to regulators. It's important to the investment community, and it gives a platform for research and increased understanding. So thank you, Karine. Now we are getting into the next phase of today's talk, and that is the panel discussion. And I'm happy to introduce the next two participants. First, Christina Øgaard. She is the first vice president and head of sustainability strategy and governance at Danske Bank. She has extensive experience in the field of sustainable finance and has been with Danske Bank for 9 years in different positions. She is representing Danske Bank in the European Banking Federation and United Nations Environment Programme, the Finance Initiative Working Group on Social Taxonomy. So you're an expert in the field, Christina. Thank you for being with us. And I'm happy also to introduce Tina Saltvedt from Nordea. Tina is Chief Analyst at the Group Sustainability Division at Nordea Bank. And before joining the Group Sustainability in January 2018, she worked as a Chief Analyst on macro and oil for 10 years at Nordea Markets. She is on the board of Zero, leading environmental NGO in Norway. Thank you, Tina. Christina, the first question goes to you. You have heard two leading figures in an area in which you are an expert. And my broad question to you, what are your key reflections when you hear this, both from the regulator side and from a leading investor's side?
First of all, thank you for having me, Ida, and thank you to Karine and Antje for some very interesting presentations. First of all, I'd like to say that we in Danske Bank, of course, warmly welcome a social taxonomy. I think it will be imperative in tidying up and creating a real market for social investments, and also to avoid social washing, as we call it. I'd like to make 3 observations. Firstly, I think it's imperative to note that the green taxonomy has filtered through from investments to lending. And investments can be global in nature, but lending is often quite local. So for Danske Bank, as a Nordic universal bank, we would of course also like to contribute to the social transformation via our lending. And we recognize that in the Nordics, there are social challenges, but they can be somewhat relatively different in nature to elsewhere. And so I would warmly recommend the working group to factor this in and create relative thresholds, for instance, on housing, instead of saying an absolute limit for which people would qualify for affordable housing, say, let's say the lowest 10% income group. So this can also be an effective tool for lending in the Nordic economies and for us to help drive the transformation through a lending book. Secondly, I'd like to move from the local to the global. I think an important difference between the green taxonomy and the social taxonomy is the scope of the impact. The green taxonomy aims to decrease CO2 emissions fundamentally and by nature. That has a global impact, whereas the social taxonomy could create impacts that are quite locally confined, often on the vertical objectives that Antje spoke to, but also to some extent on the horizontal objectives, depending on the supply chain. And so I'd like at some point for the working group to share some reflections about how we should see Europe as a global actor in this. I see some of the communication being quite centered on Europe, but where is our global responsibility beyond the supply chain? And then last but not least, I think the data here is a very salient issue. And in some ways, the Gordian knot that the working group or that we as a community have to solve It's this balance of having available and reliable data as indicators, but at the same time, creating a scalable social investment market so it doesn't become too confined, doesn't gain traction, and ends up as an asset bubble. And there I'll just briefly like to say that there is an issue on data availability right now, especially on the horizontal objectives on impact on consumers and impact on communities. There's very little data out there. We need clear definitions, for instance, vulnerable groups, data definitions, but at the same time, if it becomes too complex, companies could have a challenge in identifying, measuring, validating, and displaying their data. That could become costly and could become a detriment. At the same time, for the investors, if there's no reliable data, and we know that ESG rating providers are struggling with this, it could end up in a place where the investors have to analyze company by company, all the indicators. That would drive up costs, potentially drive up the cost of social investments, which would also not be super good. Then when it comes to the validity of data, we know that a lot of the social data would end up having a more subjective nature, as it's not science, it's more social, as Antje pointed out. And there it could be subject to interpretation. Some single actors may be prone to make a positive assessment of their own qualitative performance. And so validating the data would be quite important. Some of the data will be captured by the CSRD, the upcoming reporting directive, where they would need to be validated. But beyond that, I think data validity is key here. And just one final comment is that we also need some oversight. And some of you may have noted that the Swedish FSA have recently announced that they do not see it as their scope to safeguard the taxonomy claims that are made. They don't see it as practical to expand their competencies and capabilities to that. Conversely, the Danish FSA have created an anti-greenwashing unit to oversee claims in the Danish market. And I think especially for the social taxonomy, having robust oversight will be key to avoid that social washing still happens within the realm of the social taxonomy. So super excited to follow Antje's work and excited to provide input. It's a magnanimous task with a few Gordian knots, but I'm sure that we will succeed in the end.
Thank you very much, Christina and Ante. I'm sure that you'd like to reflect a little bit on this, these important observations. And Karine, when it comes to the data theme, it would be interesting also to hear your experience on that. But first, Ante, what is your reflections when you hear the concerns from Christina?
Yes, these are mainly the concerns on national particularities and how do we deal with that, and data. Actually, of course, those concerns are not new to us, and we haven't yet solved them completely. We are very aware about the problem of making it not too complicated for companies, and that is an issue we are talking about nearly in every session. And of course, this actually is a bit contradictory to the wish that we have to have criteria based on national situations. So we probably try to avoid this, which still is a bit of a problem, yes, but we were warned a bit against having criteria set according to different national situations. And of course, I mean, with countries having their own social regulations on which one could build on criteria, that might be one task, one way to do it. Yes. You have an additional question? You just raised your hand.
No, it was just to clarify that I was not trying to promote national-oriented criteria, more the relative thresholds. So instead of saying that the people under a certain absolute income qualify as vulnerable or particularly exposed, if you could do that on a relative level, it would be easier on a national level to actually drive some transformation for the more vulnerable groups.
Yeah, relative level would mean as defined within a certain country.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I agree with that. Yeah. And data, I mean, the situation is not so completely different to what we have in the environmental taxonomy, because here companies have to actually find a lot of data which they didn't have to do before, and to publish it. Of course, companies are a bit wary of having to do this exercise again with social, and we'll see to that. I mean, there was a question in the chat and how far we actually align this to the already coming up CSRD and SFRD requirements. And of course, we observe this process very closely, and wherever possible, it would be good to have a link. But on the other hand, probably a social taxonomy has to be more detailed, to be frank, than that, which is coming up from there.
Thank you very much, Antje. Karine, what's your reflections on the issue of both access to relevant data and the validation of the data? I mean, perhaps it's easier to count and measure CO2 emissions than some of the key issues on the social dimension. What's your experience?
Absolutely, it is. And I gave some examples from what we see when we analyze companies reporting and what companies do, that when it comes to social issues, companies are behind compared to environmental issues. And I think there's probably two reasons that. First, maybe they are behind, they have had more focus recently on, or so much focus on climate, environmental issues, but also I think it's a lack of reporting framework that's been developed for climate issues. So it's just a lack of data. And also it's much easier to quantify data on the environmental side, like how much water do you use, what's your CO2 emissions, compared to the social side. And on the social side, it is a problem that it is hard to find the quantitative metrics. What are the performance metrics? So that's clearly an issue, and we see that. And we've actually done some work to try to be part of developing better metrics, but it's absolutely clearly a challenge.
And that's something that Antje and the platform will spend time on going forward, and get input too from you and other experts. Tina, let me introduce you into the discussion. You have a dark history as an oil analyst, and you know more about the energy transition than anybody else. And of course, the energy transition that we're facing will lead to major societal changes in important parts of the world. How do you see this discussion that we're having now in the context of the energy transition, and do you see this as relevant answers?
Absolutely, because it's important to look at the E, S and G letters at the same time. I mean, when we're talking about the energy transmission, we often think about it as an E problem, a problem to the environment or the climate. But there will be big issues raising here as well on the social dimensions, because you will have a lot of countries today, or companies today, but especially countries that are raised on the income from the oil and gas and coal sectors. And what will happen if you have a fast transmission away from the fossil to the new renewable energy? Of course, the stability is a question here, the stability of the country itself, the political dimension, that some of these leaders have been, or actually are based in the positions they have now because of the income they've had from the sales of and export of oil and gas and coal. So what will happen with the stability, and what will happen with the people, not at least? Because when you have, if you don't have as much money to spend on jobs, for example, on housing issues, on education, how will that influence the people? And I think that is a lot of these questions that will actually increase in the future, and very soon, because we're seeing that as prices drop, they're starting to inflect on them. And you also have the skills. The just transition fund is one thing that the EU has suggested, but it is important to have these kind of deals so you actually have a smooth transmission for the people who are dependent on jobs, dependent on these kind of incomes. And these are social aspects, so we don't end up like we've seen in the US, for example, where especially the car industry, when a car and coal industry, with certain areas and parts of the countries have now been left without work, without the economic growth that is necessary to keep stability. And then we have to be aware of this, not only from the fossil fuels, but where we will go when we go into renewables. We will be dependent on new commodities. And we have to avoid that the same things happened here, because we know that the fossil fuels, especially oil, has been used as a political instrument and a political tool to impact on countries or developments. So we assure that we don't get the same push and trends when we're moving over to the renewable.
Absolutely, excellent reflections. Thank you very much. And we are getting questions from the audience, and I'd like to put some of them forward to you as a panel. And I think the first goes to you, Antje. How do you foresee to implement or include the social dimension of the taxonomy into the climate environment sustainability taxonomy that's already developed? Could you explain a little bit more on how you see that work in practice?
Yeah. Actually, we have come further than on this than on data, because data and concrete indicators were not yet in our mandate. But we had to work out different models, and we did work out different models on how a green and a social taxonomy could relate to each other. And basically, there are two options. On the one hand, you can keep them very separate and say, okay, you have quite detailed environmental criteria as you have them in the present taxonomy, and then you have more general social minimum safeguards attached to them. And the same would be true for the social side. You have detailed social criteria there and some general environmental criteria attached to them. Then you would keep them quite separate, and companies would report separately on social and green, and if they do both, then, well, they say if they do both. And another way to do this is to move them together a bit closer, which means that, for example, you have the environmental significant harm criteria included in the social dimension, and the social significant harm criteria included in the environmental dimension. So that would mean that companies would actually work on quite strict social and environmental criteria to become sustainable, yes, and the activities, it's based on the activities, yes, I just said companies, but it should be activities. And probably there would be less activities. If you merge the two, you probably would have less activities and less companies which actually follow both. Yeah, so these are the options on the table. And of course, it is a very sensitive subject, which has to be discussed very closely with a wider audience. So I'm happy to learn about your opinions on that as well. But these are the options which are on the table and which have been worked out and will be in the report we are putting to the public as well.
Thank you. And we have got some questions concerning the relative nature of the criterions that we are discussing here, including also cultural differences. Take one issue, family planning and contraceptives. You will see important differences in different parts of the world. And this question goes to all of you, actually. How should we reason around that? Of course, this is one of the themes in UN guiding principles and OECD standards, but how should we reason when we are talking about the social dimension in the taxonomy to see to that we are not entering fundamental cultural differences and challenges? I don't know who would like to start on that. It's probably meant to you, Antje, but I'd like to hear more perspectives on that.
Yes, perhaps just one sentence from me. That's why we actually base the social taxonomy on the UN guiding principles, because there we have agreed norms and principles which we can believe that they are accepted all over the world. It's a really difficult territory to move into more cultural aspects here.
Thank you very much. And now I'll invite both Tina, Karine, and Christina to give a short comment, both on what you would like to say, but also on what would you like to see to make this successful process going forward. And let's start with Tina. You had your hand up.
Okay, just a comment to what Antje said as well. I think it's important that we use, for example, the United Nations standards, so these kind of international organizations have set up, because they will have included a lot of these questions already, or the human rights questions already. I think it's for sure I would support better data standards and harmonization of the criteria, because we have put up a social empowerment fund, and what we have seen is it's not really difficult to find companies, and the investment universe is large. But what we see is that it's difficult actually to find a way of proving the different choices. So we are using, for example, external but also subjective standards, and there is already now questions about transparency. So better standards, harmonization, and better data for sure.
Thank you very much. 30 seconds, Karine. What would you like to see?
Yeah, I'm very much in line with Tina here. As an investor, more than 9,000 companies, nothing beats better data. But of course, we also want to see companies improve. In the end, we're interested in long-term value creation. So if companies can be better at managing social issues, that would be great.
Thank you, Karine. And Christina, you had some observations and concerns. Were they met in the comments from Antje?
Yeah, by and large, but I'd also like to of course, I agree that global standards on human rights and labor rights and so on need to create a foundation, but I think that's exactly what Antje and her team are doing. I think what I think is elegant also by your work, Antje, is that you add this AAAQ, accessibility, availability, but also acceptability, so that you ensure that if you provide a product, that it's actually acceptable by the cultural norms of the recipient group. And I really appreciate that element to this discussion. When it comes to my expectations, I can only echo Karine and Tina, but also noting this dilemma again between robust and valid and reliable data, but then on the other hand, also the scalability, because if it becomes too introverted based on too technical data, we could risk that it doesn't really catch on and becomes a side note. And that is also, I think, a challenge that I'm very happy it's in very good hands with Antje and her subgroup. The work they have done so far is very impressive. So I'm sure they'll find some good solutions for it. And also, of course, very happy to contribute to the dialogue going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. And Antje, quick comment on the key next steps and how you would like to invite comments and contributions going forward.
Yeah, as I said, it's really very good to meet you today here. So I know the faces, and we have an interchange, and I've got your email addresses as well, and you have mine. So I mean, please feel free to comment and also to write to me. And the actual, preliminary final version of the draft, or not preliminary, final version of the draft will be out in July, and it will be possible to comment on it. There will be a consultation, but of course, please also feel free to comment in a more free way to me directly with an email. That will be the next step. Yeah, I understand the point about data. Yeah, thank you for that. And of course, it's important. As I said, that has not yet been our task, but we have to come down to it. It's also very important to know that you like the acceptability part of it, because we had some pushback on that. And actually, I would like to enter on a very positive note, because it was really nice to hear Karine. Years ago, we have been working with an Indian NGO working on child labor in the Indian cotton seed production. And of course, German companies were involved and the manager of this NGO said, we saw really a change when the Norwegian wealth came in. And they had been on German television, they had really done lobbying a lot. And they said, we really saw a difference, and he could even name a number of children which are not anymore working in these fields, and there were thousands of them, because a Norwegian fund intervened. So I would like to end with this positive note.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Antje, and thank you also to Karine, Tina, and Tina to help us to cast light on this immensely important discussion, and it will be one of the key discussions going forward, and we will all engage. And this is also an example of the financial services sector not being advocates of the past or advocates of the present, but enablers of the future. So thank you very much. And let me also inform you that the next Sustainable Finance talk will be the 1st of July, where we will take a deeper dive into the link between sustainability and financial risk. You will get an invitation, and when the time gets closer to the 1st of July. Thank you very much to the audience for participating today, and have a nice day.
Thank you as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.